Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Velmurugan Periyasamy. I am part of a Hortonworks security team. I am Apache Ranger committer and a PMC member.
Hi, I'm Sailaja. I work in Hortonworks as well in Ranger dev team. And I mainly work on the user sync module in Ranger.
Today, we're going to talk about how to manage enterprise users in Hadoop. So here's how we have structured this presentation. First, I will talk about some introduction on what the user management really is and the importance of it, and some key enabling technologies that we're going to showcase in this presentation. And I will hand it over to Sailaja. She will walk through a use case of integrating a Hadoop cluster with multiple LDAP stores, which seems to be like a common ask from many customers. And she will show you a demo, and we'll end the presentation with the demo. So let me start with the question of why is this important, right? Why is managing enterprise users important? And this, I'll start with the all too familiar CIA triad, which forms the basis of any organization's key security goals. As you know, it's the CIA stands for confidentiality, which basically says only the users who have the right access should be allowed to look at the information. And integrity, which means that data should not be modified by users who don't have access. And availability. So this forms the basis of any organization's key security goals, right? Availability is if you have access, if the users have access, they should be allowed to see the data at any times. And I want to point out here the key words that forms the basis of all these goals. In confidentiality, you strive to prevent unauthorized disclosure. In integrity, you assure no unauthorized modifications to the data. And in availability, it's again, authorized use should be permitted at all times. So it all boils down to how you are managing the users and how you are administering access to them. So that's the basis of all security, right? So I don't want to preach to the choir, but we all know security is serious business, right? I want to cite a study as a side note. IBM has done this study recently. One data breach costs like an average $3.62 million. That's just as an average. Not to mention that the reputational hit that the company takes and the disruption that it causes to the business and all the regulatory and PR nightmares that the company has to go through. So the point I'm trying to make is it all boils down to how you are managing the enterprise users. That is very critical. So next, let me go through some foundations, like the key security principles that typically how these goals are achieved. The foundational principles start with authentication, right? So that authentication means users and systems, they have to have a reliable way of proving who they are. Next, you need to have authorization, define policies on access control, clearly what users can see which data. And auditing provides the trail of what has been done to the data. You have a record of access. And to manage all this, you need a way to centrally administer all this security. And when the data keeps moving around the organization, you need to protect that data by means of encryption or similar technologies, both at motion and at rest. So again, two things I want to point out here. When you centralize all these functions, that gives you efficient security. And it all boils down to how you are dealing with the users and administering all these functions. So how we do that in Hadoop environment, right? Typically, all companies have an AD or LDAP server. So when enterprise manages their users, the first point of contact into the company's network an employee makes or a system makes is through some form of a directory server. Big companies have multiple organizational units. They have multiple AD and LDAP. So the AD servers, the enterprise directory servers, they already centralize some of these foundational principles that we talked about in the previous slide. So they authenticate users. They already authorize users for the network resources, right? So what I'm saying here is the requirements for managing the users in the Hadoop environment is nothing different of what these enterprise directory servers are trying to achieve. So it's in our interest to provide seamless integration and leverage what is done by the enterprise directory servers. For managing the Hadoop clusters, you integrate the Ambari with the AD servers. For authenticating users, you utilize Kerberos and Knox, but you still integrate with the AD server. For administering resource access policies, you integrate Ranger with enterprise directory. And we have like bunch of services in the Hadoop ecosystem. And all these enterprise users need access to these services. And you manage all these through the authentication and authorization technologies that I'm going to touch upon. So before I hand it over to Sailaja, I want to briefly talk about 3 different technologies that we're going to showcase in this presentation. Those are Kerberos, Knox, and Ranger. Kerberos, it's a must. If you don't have Kerberos in your Hadoop cluster, then you don't have any security. So that's a given. And one point I want to highlight here is why Kerberos is the best fit in the Hadoop environment is Hadoop environment is like so complex that it has like so many services running on so many nodes. It is virtually impossible to ask individual users to access to each individual service to get access. So to centralize the authentication, you definitely need Kerberos. And next, I want to talk about Knox. Knox provides centralized authentication, but it does not replace Kerberos. You need Kerberos to authenticate systems, but you can use Knox to centralize authentication for the end users. So you can get a single access point for all your services to hide some of the complexity. But as I said, it does not replace Kerberos. You need Knox as well as Kerberos. And finally, Ranger. So again, all these technologies, they all talk about centralizing the key security functions, how you are administering centrally the security functions, right? Ranger provides authorization and auditing centrally in a single pane of glass for majority of the Hadoop ecosystem services. As you can see, it now supports HDFS, Hive, HBase, Yarn, Knox, Storm, Kafka, Atlas. It integrates with all the major services. And it's very extensible. You can write your own. If you have a custom system, you can write your own plugin and then integrate the authorization policies and manage them via the Ranger portal. You can provide, it's very flexible. It provides fine-grained access control. And another thing I wanted to point out was all these technologies, they provide seamless integration to enterprise directory server, which is a key requirement for managing all the users in the Hadoop environment. I'll now hand it over to Sailaja to talk about the use case that we are going to demo here.
Thanks, Will. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more detailed about how the user management is done, mainly in two different areas. One is authentication using Knox and authorization using Ranger. So what are the requirements for user management? In order to configure Knox or Ranger for managing these users, to understand who can authenticate and who has access to what services, we first need to understand what is the deployment that Hadoop is going to use. So in order to understand, there are several factors that we need to consider. The first one is, as obviously we all know, where the enterprise users are existing. What type of directory servers are they residing on? Is it an Active Directory server, or is it an open LDAP server, etc.? And the next thing that we want to know is what kind of OS version that is running on Hadoop nodes. So is it a CentOS, or is it a Ubuntu, etc.? Then the next thing that we wanted to also take into consideration is what is the user group mapping configured on Hadoop clusters. How the users are going to be ported into Hadoop cluster in order to access the resources. Are the users going to be ported using SSSD, or is CoreSite.xml is configured directly to talk to AD or LDAP server to bring in the users, or the users are created manually on the Hadoop nodes? So let's touch upon a little bit on what is SSSD. So for us, in this, for this presentation, the main things that we wanted to use with SSSD are two features. One is the authentication using pluggable authentication model, and the other one is called NSS, Name Service Switch, which provides the user group information that is happening, that has the collection of users and group information. Then the next one that we need to consider is what kind of authentication mechanism that we are going to use. As well pointed out, are we going to use only Kerberos in the deployment, or do we want to use Knox gateway as a single point authentication for end users, etc.? Then we also need to understand what kind of policies that are going to be configured on Ranger and how they are enforced. Are they configured at user level or at group level? So first, let's see how the user management in Knox is done. So Knox has provided three different types of topologies. One is to integrate directly with Active Directory or LDAP, and the other one is it also can integrate with Kerberos. You can use Kerberos in Knox for authentication, and it also supports a pluggable authentication model using SSSD framework. So let's look at how the typical authentication flow in Knox happens. So as we saw, there is a single point authentication using Knox. So the user tries to access a simple web HDFS resource. and then he requests Knox, and Knox internally, it performs the authentication. In this case, I took an example of PAM authentication, and then it gives access to the different services behind. So now how the user management in Ranger is done. Before that, we also need to understand where Ranger uses these users and groups, what it is using it for. It uses it in 3 different places. One, while configuring the policies in Ranger, the user and group information is required, and while authorization, as well as for auditing. So the user group management in Ranger is mainly handled by a module called user sync. The key responsibility for the user sync module is to sync the users and groups from a given sync source and then provide that information periodically to the Ranger so that they are available for policy creation. So in order to sync the users and groups from Active Directory or LDAP, there are many different ways Ranger provides configuration options to support different use cases. For example, if we want to sync only the groups to configure the group level policies, Ranger provides an option to sync only the groups from the Active Directory or an LDAP server. But if you want to give a user level permissions, you can configure Ranger to sync only the users and vice versa. And we also provide different options to limit the users and groups that are synced to the Ranger from an enterprise directory server so that you can sync only the ones that you want to configure the policies for. Then we also recently introduced user sync audits, which basically gives you the information on for every periodic sync, any new groups are added or new users have been added or updated. And then for every sync, till then, what is the snapshot? How many users and groups have been synced at that particular time? So as we talked, there are multiple sync sources that Ranger supports to sync the users and groups from. The first one, as we talked before, it can sync the users and groups, talk to directory servers like AD or LDAP, and you can configure a particular organizational unit or multiple organizational units and sync the users and groups from there. It also supports like Unix native users reading in from etc password or etc group files. So in HTTP 3.0, we also introduced the support for gathering the information of users and groups using NSS. Then the last sync source that we support is the file-based, where users and groups can be written in a file in a CSV or JSON format, and you can sync the users and groups from there. So the typical user synchronization in Ranger looks like this. We have our directory servers like Active Directory and Free IPA. In this example, I'm using user syncing from multiple LDAP stores via SSSD and NSS module. And Ranger user sync contacts SSSD and imports the users and groups from NSS, like using get ENT password or get ENT groups, and then updates Ranger admin periodically with the changes, and then Ranger admin finally writes it into the database. These user and group information can be used for configuring the policies later. So let's take a simple use case that today I want to demo. So this one we keep getting from many customers. They're asking about this, how we can integrate multiple LDAP stores into Hadoop. So they have multiple LDAP directory servers and the users are existing in these directory servers, and they are across multiple countries, and they all want to access a single enterprise data lake cluster. So for the demo setup, I have an Active Directory onto your left. It is a domain Ranger QE hortonworks.com. And onto the right, we have a free IPA server that has a domain called rangerdev.hortonworks.com. So I highlighted a user on both the domains. As you can see, the same user called Bob Hall is existing on both the domains. So we will talk about how this username conflicts can be handled in our use case. Do we want to treat the users as two different users, or do we want to treat it as same user? So the typical flow of any user action to the Hadoop environment looks like this. So we have, in this setup, we have multiple LDAP stores, and the users are existing on both the LDAP stores. And we have SSSD running on all the nodes of the cluster. And then we have Ranger integrated with SSSD, and the users and groups are synced using NSS. And we have Apache Knox, which uses PAM to authenticate the users. So here, a typical flow is like when a user runs a Hive query, the first request goes to Knox, and Knox tries to authenticate the user with PAM. And once the authentication is successful, it sends the request to Hive. And here, as you can see, Ranger already has policies that can enforce the policies for any Hive queries here. So in order to do this setup, what all the steps that are involved? So for this demo, I took a HTTP 3.0 cluster that has CentOS running on all the nodes. And I also set up an Active Directory and free IPA setup, and both have two different domains. Then I set up SSSD with PAM and NSS services enabled on all the nodes. This will be useful for getting the users from both the directory servers. Then I configured Knox with PAM for authentication, and I configured Ranger admin with PAM authentication as well. And for user sync, I configured NSS to get the user and group information. Then finally, like as Vail mentioned, we always wanted a secure cluster, so Kerberos is mandatory. So we set up HDFS and Hive with Kerberos authentication. So how the sample SSSD configuration looks like in this case. Here I want to point out few quick configurations that we are interested in for today's demo. So as we talked, I have two domains. One is the Ranger QE, and the other one is the Ranger dev. And you specify what type of directory server it is by using the ID provider. As you can see, the first case, I have ID provider as AD. And in the next case, I have the ID provider as LDAP. And as we spoke before, we have a same user on both the domains, how we want to handle that. So that can be handled by using a configuration in SSSD called use fully qualified names. If this is set to true, we are telling SSSD, hey, get me the users or groups with the full domain information in the name. So that way you can tell if you want to treat the user from two different domains as a different user, or is it the same user. So the configuration on Knox for PAM authentication, it is pretty simple. One place we need to configure, which is the advanced topology. The realm you need to specify as Knox PAM realm. And for Ranger, the configuration for Ranger with PAM authentication and user sync with NSS, this one is introduced in Ambari 2.7 and HTTP 3.0. So for PAM authentication, you need two configuration parameters. One is to set the authentication method to PAM, and the other one, the password validator, should be configured with corresponding validator. Then, of course, for NSS, is configured as a Unix backend for user sync to sync the users and groups. So let's look at the demo today. So since I have Active Directory and free IPA that are not set up on my virtual environment on my laptop, I recorded a demo so that I can access the clusters in our test environment. What is this one? Do I need to?
Drag it there.
Open it. Enter. Did it come?
Is this the demo? No.
No, that one.
Wait, so. Wait a minute. It's not
Audio, we need audio.
okay. Will it work now?
So let's look at few quick configuration on Ranger first. How to? So I want to show you that for the authentication, in Ranger we have authentication method as PAM, and as we saw before, the password validator is configured accordingly. And for user sync, to sync the users, I configured NSS as the Unix backend. This way, the user sync uses the users and groups from using getEnt password and getEnt group to sync the users and groups from SSSD. And SSSD internally, as we saw, it is getting the users and groups from two different domains called Ranger QE and Ranger Dev. Similarly, I want to show you how Knox is configured with PAM authentication. So the advanced topology is configured with Knox PAM realm. So now let's log into Ranger admin UI and see how the policies are configured and how the users and groups are synced to Ranger and how audits are done in Ranger for different users. Now I am logging in as an admin user. So first thing I want to show you are the users and groups, how they are synced to Ranger. few users that we are interested in are these ones. As you can see, for Ranger Dev, I configured using a fully qualified name, fully qualified name. So as you can see, there is a user called bhall, which is existing in both Ranger Dev and Ranger QE domains. So here, since I configured for one domain with fully qualified name, I get the user as this, and he is part of few groups. And as you also can see, here I configured the user with admin role. Whereas the same user which is existing on Ranger QE domain, and I did not configure fully qualified name for this one, so I get a short name for this user with, and here I configured this user with only user role. So now also we will see the policies in Ranger, specifically the ones that use Knox proxy. So I have a web HDFS policy configured with two users called new test4, which is from the Ranger QE domain, which with a short name of the user, and I have bhall with fully qualified domain name from Ranger Dev, and I have allow permission for these two users. So now first I want to show you how Ranger uses PAM authentication to log in the users. So now let's log in with one of the user from a domain that doesn't have a fully qualified name. So here Ranger uses PAM authentication, and since this user has a user role, as we saw, he couldn't edit any of the resources, or he can't see the audits or user group settings, etc. So now let's log in with another user that has admin privileges. And as you can see, since this user has admin privileges, he can edit all the policies, he can see the audits, he can see the user group settings, etc. So now let's look at how Knox uses PAM authentication for accessing the resources, like web HDFS in our example. So let's run a simple web HDFS command to list the directory structure. And here I am logging in as a user called bhall, which is from Ranger QE, and he doesn't have any access to the resources from Ranger. We did not configure any policies for this user. So the access should be denied by Ranger. So that's what we get here. And similarly, if I log in with a different user who has access, and I'm running the same web HDFS command, and you can see you can look at the directory structure here for that user. Now let's look at the audits in Ranger, how it is done. So as you can see, the user which has allow access is allowed with using this policy and the Ranger ACL, whereas the user with short name, he doesn't have access, so it is denied by Ranger. So now how to switch back? Hi, for today's demo, I want to go to the presentation. So what all the conclusions or key takeaways from this demo or from this presentation? So the first thing, we want to use Kerberos in the Hadoop environment. It is not, Knox is not a replacement for Kerberos. So it is still required to keep the cluster secure. And then we also saw that we can integrate seamlessly with enterprise directory servers. And if there are multiple directory servers, you can integrate using SSSD. And we also showed how Ranger can be centralized for authorization and auditing. So with this, I want to open up for questions.
So if I understand Knox and Kerberos, so Knox is kind of that variant of the cluster itself, and Kerberos operates inside?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. We are using only for Hadoop resources. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.